I was born to the sound of fire. It has followed me all my life, the crackle of wood, the hiss of boiling oil, the whisper of burning skin. The kitchen was my cradle and my prison, the place where I learned to move without being seen, to breathe without being heard, to serve without being thanked. They called me cook, but I was never free enough to deserve a name. Every morning began with smoke. Before the first rooster crowed, I would light the fire beneath the big iron pots. My hands trembling from the cold, my body still aching from yesterday's lashes. The air was heavy with the scent of grease, onions, and ash. My fingers bore blisters upon blisters, yet I learned to love the pain. Because pain was the only thing that reminded me I was still alive. Above my head, the masters slept. Their rooms were filled with silks and laughter, while I crouched in the dark corner of the kitchen feeding flames that never belonged to me. I watched their shadows flicker across the walls, long, golden, untouchable. Each time I stirred a pot, I imagined their faces in the reflection of the bubbling broth. I told myself I wasn't stirring soup. I was stirring fate. I used to think food could heal. Back when I was a child on the plantation, my mother would sneak me scraps corn mush, dried fruit, a handful of rice, and she'd say, "A good cook can make a man forget his sorrow." But the men I cooked for never forgot their cruelty. They carried it in their laughter, in their footsteps, in the way they threw bones to the floor after a feast, as if even the remains of joy belonged only to them. The kitchen became my world and my cage. I knew its every sound. The creak of the pantry door, the rhythm of the knives, the soft thud of dough under my fists. I learned to move through the chaos with grace, to smile when they watched, and to hide the anger that rose like steam inside me. The other slaves avoided the kitchen. They said it smelled like death and submission. Maybe it did. But to me it smelled like power waiting to be claimed. The master's wife, they called her Miss Charlotte, was the kind of woman who wore perfume to breakfast and cruelty to bed. She liked to remind me that I was nothing but a hand to her table. "You cook because we allow it," she'd say, tapping her fan against my cheek. "Without us, you'd starve." I used to bow my head and whisper, "Yes, ma'am," but inside I was counting. Every insult, every order, every time she made me kneel to scrub the floor with the same hands that seasoned her food. And the master, he was worse, a man of wealth and pride, but empty of soul. His voice echoed through the halls like a sermon, but his heart was black as soot. I saw the way he looked at the girls, the young ones, trembling in their aprons. I saw how he made promises with smiles and broke them with silence. Once he came to the kitchen drunk, demanding roast pork at midnight. When I said the fire was out, he grabbed me by the wrist and pressed my hand against the iron stove. I remember the smell of my own flesh. I remember the laughter that followed. That was the night I stopped praying for freedom. From then on, I prayed for something else. Revenge. The word became a secret seasoning in my thoughts. I added it to every dish, every breath. I tasted it when I licked salt from my wounds. It was bitter at first. Then it began to taste like power. Years passed like smoke. I grew older, quieter, harder. The other servants came and went, but I remained the invisible hand behind every feast, the silent witness to every cruelty. They thought I was loyal. They thought I was broken. But they didn't know what it means to watch people eat and know you control every flavor that enters their mouth. They didn't know that even a slave can rule from the shadows if she learns the right recipes. Then came the wedding. I remember the first time I heard the news that the master's eldest daughter was to be married. The house buzzed like a hive, alive with preparations. Dresses were sewn, candles polished, silver polished until it shone like mirrors. The kitchen became a battlefield. "You will make the feast of your life," Miss Charlotte said. "The guests must remember our family's glory." I bowed my head and said, "Yes, ma'am." But inside I whispered, "They will remember more than glory." For weeks I worked day and night. I roasted, baked, and boiled until my body ached. The smell of sugar and fat clung to my skin like a curse. I prepared pastries so delicate they could melt on a tongue, meats so tender they fell apart at a glance. Everyone praised my cooking, the mistress, the bride, even the master himself. "You've outdone yourself," he said with a grin that made my stomach turn. I smiled back. My hands were steady, but my heart was no longer soft. Because in every dish I made, I saw the ghosts of those who never lived to see a day of peace. My mother, the girls who cried in silence, the men who worked until their backs broke. They all watched through my eyes, whispering, "Make them taste what we felt." At night, when the kitchen was empty, I would sit by the dying fire and think about how a single choice could change everything. The world above me, the one built on my labor, didn't know that one day, a cook's hand could become God's hand. The guests would come in carriages, dressed in lace and pride. They would eat until their bellies burst. They would toast to happiness, to legacy, to the family's future. And I, the nameless cook, would stand in the shadows, smiling, waiting for the right moment. Sometimes I wondered if it was wrong, if vengeance would make me like them. But then I would remember the laughter, the burns, the nights of hunger. I would remember that justice doesn't come to the quiet. Sometimes it has to be cooked. When the dawn of the wedding day arrived, I stood in the kitchen before the fire, watching the flames dance. I felt no fear, no guilt, no joy, only stillness, the kind that comes when a storm is about to break. I whispered to the fire, "Today, they will eat from my hands." And the fire whispered back, "Then let it begin." When people talk about the South, they like to speak of magnolia trees and golden fields, of summer nights filled with laughter and music drifting from the verandas of great houses. They never talk about the screams that echoed beneath those same roofs, or the hands that bled to make those gardens bloom. The riverside plantation looked like paradise from the outside, but I knew better. I lived in the kitchen, the heart of the house, and from there I saw everything. The Riverside family was respected, feared, even admired by other planters. But behind the fine clothes and soft manners were hearts carved out of stone. Colonel Addison Riverside was the head of it all, tall, polished, a man who spoke of God with the same mouth that cursed us. He liked to remind everyone that his plantation ran on order and discipline. He called it the natural way of things. We called it hell. Addison's wife, Pearl, was born into cruelty. Her father had been a Thompson, one of the oldest slaveholding families in Mississippi. She'd grown up thinking obedience was love and punishment was justice. When she married Addison, it wasn't a union of hearts, but of power. Together, they ruled the plantation like gods who had forgotten mercy. Their children, Thomas, Mary, and little David, were the only soft things left in that house. I had raised them in my kitchen, fed them from my own hands, wiped their tears when they cried. They called me Aunt Celia, though their mother hated it. "Don't let them forget she's the help," she'd scold the children, but they didn't care. To them I was comfort, the smell of bread, the hum of a lullaby, the warmth of a story, whispered by candlelight. I loved those children more than I ever thought I could love again, maybe because I saw in them what I never had: innocence. And for a time, that love softened me. It made me forget the anger burning inside. I told myself I could survive this life, as long as I had their laughter in my kitchen. But laughter doesn't last long in a place built on suffering. One winter, sickness spread through the quarters. Fever took hold of the slave cabins first. We lost 3 men and 2 women before the doctor even arrived. I remember begging the mistress to send medicine, but she waved me off. "They'll either live or die," she said, sipping tea by the fire. "Nature has its ways." When the fever reached the main house, it came for the children. Little Thomas went first. He was only 6, curious and gentle, always asking questions I couldn't answer. "Aunt Celia, why do you sleep by the fire?" "Aunt Celia, why can't you sit with us at supper?" He had a way of looking at me that made me forget what I was property. When his fever rose, I stayed by his side, pressing cool cloths to his forehead, whispering prayers I wasn't sure God could hear anymore. The doctor came, but he didn't touch Thomas. He just looked at me and said, "If the Lord wants him, he'll take him." The Lord didn't take him. The fever did. Mary followed 2 days later. She had her mother's eyes, sharp and blue, but her father's smile kind, almost innocent. I remember holding her when she stopped breathing. Her little fingers clung to my apron until the end. I wanted to scream, but the sound never came. By the time David fell ill, I had already died once inside. He was only 4, too small to fight the fever that burned through his body. I begged the mistress again to bring help. I fell to my knees in front of her chair. I kissed her slippers. She looked down at me with disgust. "You forget yourself," she said coldly. "They're my children, not yours." Then she told me to return to the kitchen. I disobeyed her for the first time in my life. I stayed by David's bed until his small chest stopped rising. When I finally left that room, the world no longer looked the same. The sun still shone through the windows, but everything felt colder. The next morning, the mistress ordered me to prepare the funeral meal. "Life goes on," she said, her voice flat. "You'll make turtle soup and roast duck. The guests must be fed." I cooked with shaking hands, tasting nothing, feeling nothing. Each spoon I lifted was heavy with sorrow. When the guests came to pay respects, they praised the food, said it was the best meal Celia ever made. I wanted to laugh, to cry, to throw the pots into the fire, but I didn't. I smiled. I bowed. I served. That was the day I realized something. These people believed they owned me. They believed they owned grief itself, that even in mourning I had no right to feel. But I did feel. I felt more than they could ever imagine. And that feeling turned to something sharp, something alive. After the funeral, I went to the small graveyard behind the fields. I knelt before 3 small mounds of earth marked with wooden crosses. I pressed my palms to the dirt and whispered their names. Thomas, Mary, David. I promised them I would not forget. I promised that their deaths would not go unanswered. That night, as I washed the blood-stained pans, Samuel, one of the field hands, and the only soul who ever saw me cry, came to the kitchen. He took my burned hand in his and said, "Don't let them break you, Celia." "They already have," I whispered. He shook his head. "No, they think they have, but they don't know what a woman does when she's got nothing left to lose." Those words stayed with me. In the weeks that followed, I changed. I still cooked, still smiled, still bowed my head when the mistress walked in. But something new was growing inside me, quiet, patient, dangerous. I began collecting herbs from the edges of the woods, plants Mama Ruth had once taught me about before she died. Some healed, some killed. I learned to tell them apart by touch, by smell, by the way they burned my tongue when I tasted them. Each night I wrote in my little notebook, the same one Mama Ruth had given me to learn my letters. I filled it with recipes at first, but soon the pages held something else. Reflections, memories, plans. I wrote about justice, about silence, about the weight of forgotten pain. And one night, by candlelight, I wrote the words that sealed my fate. They think they are invisible. They think we don't see, don't remember, don't feel. But we are the living memory of all their sins. And memory, when it finally speaks, will echo for centuries. When I finished writing, I signed a name that was mine, truly mine for the first time. Celia Washington, not Celia the cook, not Celia the slave, Celia Washington. I chose that name because I was done being someone's property. I was done carrying their name like a shackle. Washington meant freedom, the dream whispered among those who dared to run north. I wasn't running, not yet, but I was becoming something else. From that night on, I knew what I was going to do. I would not scream. I would not run. I would make them taste what they had done. I would serve them justice, slow-cooked, sweet, and unforgiving. And when the spring came to Mississippi in 1849, I was ready. The day they announced the wedding, the plantation buzzed like a hornet's nest. Miss Pearl's niece, young Charlotte, was to marry a rich cotton merchant from Baton Rouge, a union made not of love, but of money and status. I remember standing in the kitchen doorway that morning, watching Pearl's face glow as she spoke to the other white ladies gathered in the parlor. Her voice was bright and sugar-coated, but beneath it, I could hear the sharp edge of pride. "This wedding," she said, "will be the grandest celebration Riverside has ever seen." Her words carried through the hall like a sermon. I stood quietly, unseen as always, my hands folded before me. To the mistress, I was not a person. I was a shadow that moved when ordered, a mouth that said, "Yes, ma'am," and "Right away, ma'am." But that day, for the first time in my life, I smiled behind her back because I knew something she didn't. For weeks, I had been preparing. My collection of herbs had grown, hidden deep behind the spice shelf where no white hand would ever look. Foxglove, nightshade, oleander, and the small red berries of a wild vine that grew by the riverbank, deadly when boiled just right. I had tested them on rats, on a stray dog once, on a piece of meat left out in the Sunday. I learned the doses that killed quick and the ones that killed slow. This wedding would be their feast, and I would serve them my masterpiece. But before the feast came the frenzy. Riverside was alive with activity. Slaves scrubbed the floors until their fingers bled, polished silver that gleamed like mirrors, and hung garlands of flowers that filled the air with a sweetness I couldn't stand. The mistress barked orders from dawn till dusk, her voice cutting through the house like a whip. "Celia, make sure the duck is crisp. The guests must remember the taste." "Yes, ma'am." "Celia, don't forget the lemon cakes. Charlotte loves them." "Yes, ma'am." Every word she said built the rhythm of my plan. I smiled when she scolded me. I bowed when she praised me. I moved through that kitchen like a ghost, silent, careful, waiting for my moment. Samuel noticed the change in me. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the cotton fields, he came to the back door while I was washing pots. He leaned against the wall, his face half lit by the fading light. "Celia," he said softly, "you're planning something. I can see it in your eyes." I didn't answer. My hands kept moving in the water. "You can't hide it from me," he continued. "I've seen that look before in men who went north, in women who couldn't bear another day of it." I looked up at him then. "And what did they do?" He sighed. "Some made it, some didn't. I dried my hands and turned to him fully. "This ain't about running, Samuel. It's about remembering." He frowned. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath. "They took everything from me. My mama, my babies, my name. You think I can just go on cooking their meals like none of it happened? You think the Lord would want me to forgive them?" Samuel's eyes softened. "I don't know what the Lord wants," he said. "But I know this: if you go down that road, there ain't no coming back." I looked away. "I already crossed that line, Samuel. The night I buried them children, I crossed it." He didn't say another word. He just nodded and walked away, his shadow stretching long across the dirt yard. I knew he wouldn't tell anyone. Samuel had lost as much as I had, maybe more. The week of the wedding arrived. Guests poured in from neighboring plantations, arriving in carriages trimmed with gold. The house was filled with perfume, laughter, and the rustle of silk dresses. I moved among them like air, invisible, carrying trays of tea and sugared nuts. They didn't even see me, not really. And that invisibility was my greatest weapon. 2 days before the wedding, I began preparing the sauces. The duck sauce, the turtle soup, the sweet glaze for the ham, all perfect places to hide a secret. But I couldn't just pour poison into every dish. That would have been foolish. I needed it to look natural, like sickness, like chance. So I chose carefully. A little in the wine, a touch in the gravy, and just enough in the lemon cakes, Charlotte's favorite, to seal the fate of anyone who shared her joy. On the morning of the wedding, the house was chaos. The bride cried because her veil had torn, the mistress screamed at the servants for walking too slow, and the master shouted for his boots. I stayed calm. My hands didn't shake once. I baked, stirred, and seasoned with the precision of a woman who had rehearsed every movement 100 times in her mind. When I pulled the duck from the oven, its skin glistened like gold. The air was thick with the smell of roasted meat and herbs. Guests were already arriving, their laughter echoing down the halls. I looked at the table, the silverware polished, the crystal glasses shining, and felt a strange calm wash over me. It was time. As the sun climbed high, the ceremony began under the magnolia trees. I watched from the kitchen window as Charlotte walked down the aisle in her white dress, her face glowing with youth and foolish hope. The master and mistress stood beside her, proud and radiant. I wondered if they remembered the children buried out back. I wondered if they ever thought of the lives they had crushed beneath their boots. When the vows were spoken and the guests cheered, I turned back to my kitchen. I ladled the soup into silver tureens, poured the wine into crystal decanters, and placed the lemon cakes on their finest platter. My hands moved like they were guided by something beyond me, not anger anymore, but destiny. As I carried the first tray to the dining hall, the laughter grew louder. Glasses clinked. The master's voice boomed above the rest. To love, to family, and to Riverside. I stood in the doorway, smiling as I set the dishes before them. None of them looked at me, not really. They saw the food, not the hands that made it. They saw comfort, not vengeance. One by one, they began to eat. The first cough came from the bride's father. He dabbed his mouth with a napkin, frowning. Then the mistress reached for her wine, her hand trembling. The sound of laughter turned into confusion. Someone gasped. Someone else groaned. I stood very still, my heart pounding like thunder in my chest. And then it began, the screams. One by one, they fell. The master clutched his throat, his face turning red, then pale. The bride collapsed onto the table, her white gown stained with spilled wine. The guests shouted, chairs toppled, dishes shattered. I didn't move, I just watched, and when it was over, when the hall was filled with silence broken only by the crackle of the fire, I finally exhaled. In that moment, I felt no joy, no triumph, only peace. They would never hurt anyone again. When the screaming stopped, the world went quiet, in a way I'd never heard before. It wasn't peace, it was the silence that comes after thunder, when the air still trembles with the memory of what just happened. The dining hall was a graveyard of fine linen and broken glass. The smell of roasted duck and spilled wine mixed with the bitter sting of vomit and blood. I stood at the edge of the room, my apron still clean, my hands folded before me like I was waiting for new instructions. My heart was pounding so hard I thought they'd hear it, but no one did because they were all too busy dying. The mistress was the first to fall completely still. Her head lay against the table, her blonde curls soaked in wine. Her eyes were open wide, unseeing, shocked. The master tried to stand, gasping, clutching his throat. His mouth opened like he wanted to speak, to call for help, to curse my name. But no sound came out. He fell backward, his chair splintering under his weight. One by one, they all went down. The bride, the groom, the guests, men and women who had laughed while we bled. The same people who had come to this house to drink, to dance, to show off their wealth, now they lay sprawled on the floor, their fine clothes ruined, their faces twisted in agony. I remember looking at their bodies and feeling nothing but stillness inside me, no triumph, no fear, just the strange quiet of a storm that had finally run its course. Then came the sound of footsteps. Samuel burst into the hall, his face pale as ashes. Behind him were two field hands, eyes wide with confusion and terror. "Celia," he whispered, looking around at the carnage. "What have you done?" I didn't answer. I just looked at him, and in my silence, he knew. His eyes filled with something between horror and pity. "You got to get out of here," he said quickly. "Now, before the overseer finds you." But I didn't move. My feet felt rooted to the ground, like the house itself was holding me there. "I ain't running, Samuel," I said quietly. "This is my place. This is where it ends." He grabbed my arm, his hand rough with dirt and fear. "They'll hang you, Celia. They'll burn you for this." I pulled my arm free. "Then let them. I already been burning my whole life." He stared at me for a long time, and then, without another word, he turned and left. I watched him go, knowing I'd never see him again. It wasn't long before the overseer came. His name was Harris, a cruel man with a red face and a whip that never left his belt. He stepped into the hall and froze when he saw the bodies. His eyes darted from the master to the mistress, to the guests, and then to me. "What happened here?" he shouted. I didn't speak. He stepped closer, his boots crunching over shattered glass. "What did you do, girl?" I looked at him, my voice calm. "I served dinner." He lunged forward, grabbing me by the throat. His fingers dug into my skin, cutting off my breath. "You filthy witch," he spat. "You poisoned them." I didn't struggle. I didn't blink. I just looked him in the eye until he let go. By then, the other slaves had gathered outside the doorway, whispering, praying under their breath. They knew what this meant. Not just for me, but for all of us. When white blood was spilled, no black soul was safe. Within the hour, riders were sent to fetch the sheriff from town. The bodies were laid out in the parlor, their faces covered with sheets. The house that had once been full of laughter now echoed with sobs and murmurs. I was locked in the smokehouse. No light, no air, just the stench of old meat and ashes. My hands were bound, though I didn't fight. I sat there on the dirt floor, listening to the sounds of men shouting outside, horses neighing, dogs barking. Night fell slow and heavy. I could hear the river in the distance, the wind rustling through the trees. Somewhere out there the world kept turning, indifferent to what I had done. When the door finally creaked open, a lantern's glow flooded the small space. The sheriff stepped inside, a tall, thin man with a mustache that looked like it had been drawn on. Behind him stood Harris, his face red with anger. The sheriff looked me over like I was a strange creature he'd never seen before. "You're the cook?" "Yes, sir." "You served them their last meal?" "Yes, sir." He scratched his chin. "And you're saying you don't know how they all dropped dead at the same time?" I met his eyes. Maybe the Lord got tired of waiting. Harris cursed and struck me across the face. The blow sent me to the ground, but I didn't cry out. The sheriff raised a hand to stop him. "That's enough," he said sharply. "If she did it, we'll know soon enough." They dragged me out of the smokehouse and into the courtyard. The other slaves stood in a circle, silent, watching. Some of them looked at me with fear, others with something like awe. "Celia," whispered Ruthie, a young girl from the washhouse. "Did you really do it?" I turned to her and said, "I did what needed to be done." The sheriff took me into town that night. They chained my hands and feet, threw me into the back of a wagon, and rode under the moonlight. The air was cold, sharp, almost clean. I looked up at the stars and thought of Thomas, Mary, and David. I hoped they could see me, that they knew I hadn't forgotten. When we reached the jailhouse, they locked me in a small stone cell. The sheriff told the jailer to keep a watch, but I could tell by the look on his face that he didn't think I'd make it to trial. They'd already decided what I was: a murderer, a devil, a slave who forgot her place. Days passed. I lost track of time. They brought me food once a day, bread so hard I could barely chew it. I didn't eat much anyway. My hunger was gone, replaced by something deeper, heavier, the weight of what I'd done and what was still to come. Then one evening a stranger came. He was a preacher from town, a black man, rare and brave for his time. The sheriff had allowed him to visit, maybe thinking he could scare a confession out of me with holy words. He sat outside the bars, Bible in hand. "Sister," he said softly, "they say you killed them all." I nodded. "I did." He blinked, startled. "Do you feel remorse?" I thought for a long moment before answering. "Remorse is for those who had a choice. I was born in chains. Every breath I ever took was stolen from me. If this is sin, then let it be the last one they ever teach me." The preacher lowered his eyes. "They're going to hang you." "I know." "Then pray, child. Pray for mercy." I smiled, not bitter but calm. I already got my mercy. It came on the wedding day. When he left, I closed my eyes and whispered a prayer of my own, not for forgiveness but for remembrance. I asked that my story not be buried with me, that someone, someday, would tell it true. And in that cold, dark cell, I finally slept without dreams. They brought me to the courthouse 3 days after my arrest. I remember the sky that morning heavy with clouds, gray like ashes. The town square was already full of people when the wagon rolled in. Men stood with their hats low, women whispered behind gloved hands, and children pointed like they'd never seen a monster before. To them, I wasn't Celia the cook anymore. I was the poison woman, the witch of Riverside, the slave who had brought down an entire family with her stew. The sheriff dragged me from the wagon, the chains clinking around my ankles. The courthouse doors loomed high above, white columns gleaming like bones in the pale light. I walked up those steps one at a time, my wrists bound, my head high. They wanted me to look broken, but I refused to give them that. Inside, the air smelled of dust and tobacco. The judge sat at the front, an old man with a white beard and cold eyes. The jury was made of planters and merchants, 12 men who had probably eaten food cooked by hands like mine all their lives, but never once looked at the faces behind it. When I took my seat, the whispers began to rise like flies. "That's her, the slave cook. She poisoned her masters, killed the bride too. Lord have mercy, she don't even look sorry." I kept my gaze fixed ahead. I had learned long ago that silence could be its own kind of power. The prosecutor, a plump man with a red face, stood and began to speak. He called me a serpent, a demon, a symbol of everything dangerous about giving slaves too much trust. He said I had been given privilege, responsibility, a place of honor in the house, and that I had repaid it with betrayal and blood. He spoke like he was telling a story, his voice swelling and falling, holding the crowd in his hand. Every now and then, he'd point at me, and the people would murmur like they were at church, agreeing with every word. When he finished, the judge turned to the defense, though calling it a defense was generous. My lawyer was a young white man, barely more than a boy. He'd been assigned to me because no one else wanted the case. His hands trembled when he stood. "Your Honor," he began, "my client is a woman of limited understanding. She has lived her entire life in servitude, with no education, no guidance. If she did what is claimed, it was not out of malice, but out of confusion. She cannot fully comprehend." "Stop," I said, my voice cutting through the room. He froze, looking at me in shock. "I knew what I was doing," I said, my voice steady. I understood every bit of it. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge banged his gavel, shouting for order. My lawyer's face went pale. "Celia, please," he whispered, "don't." But I kept going. "They called me servant," I said, turning my eyes toward the jury. "But I was their slave. I cooked their meals, cleaned their mess, buried their children, and they never once saw me as human. I did what I did because I remembered every whip, every scream, every grave they left behind. You want to call that evil? Then maybe evil's been cooking in your kitchens all along." The room fell silent. The judge's gavel struck again and again, but I barely heard it. For the first time in my life, they were listening. Maybe not to understand, but they were hearing me. The trial lasted 2 days, though the verdict had already been decided long before I spoke. Witness after witness came forward. Harris, the overseer, told them I was an ungrateful wench with eyes full of hate. A young servant girl said she saw me stirring something into the wine. Though I knew she hadn't, she was just scared. Even Samuel was called to the stand. He stood there, his hat in his hands, his voice trembling. "Celia was always kind," he said. "She worked hard. She cared for the children like they was her own." "Did she ever speak of harming the family?" the prosecutor asked. Samuel hesitated. "No, sir," he said finally, "but I seen the pain in her eyes." The prosecutor smiled thinly. "Pain turns to wickedness, doesn't it?" Samuel didn't answer. When they brought the doctor to testify, he spoke in long, cold words. He said the cause of death was poisoning, confirmed by the remains of food found on the table. He listed the names of the victims like he was reading ingredients from a recipe. Each name was another stone on my grave. By the end of the second day, everyone knew what the verdict would be. The jury didn't even leave the room for an hour. When they returned, the foreman stood and said the words I had been expecting: "Guilty of murder, on all counts." The judge looked down at me. Celia, the court finds you guilty of the most heinous crime imaginable, the deliberate and calculated murder of your masters and their guests. You are hereby sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. May God have mercy on your soul. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I simply nodded. They led me back to the jailhouse as the crowd pressed against the steps, shouting, spitting, throwing curses. Some shouted that I should burn, others shouted that I should be made an example, but through the noise I heard one small voice, Ruthie's. She was standing in the crowd, tears streaming down her face. "Celia," she cried, "they can't kill what's already free." Her words carried above the mob for just a moment before the sheriff shoved me into the wagon. That night back in my cell, I thought about what the preacher had said about mercy, about prayer. I thought about the children, about Samuel, about the faces of the dead. I wondered if I'd gone too far, if I'd damned my soul beyond saving. But then I remembered the graves behind the plantation, the way the mistress had sipped tea while my babies burned with fever. If there was sin in me, it was born from their cruelty. A few days later, the preacher came again. He sat by my bars in silence for a long time before speaking. "You could have begged for mercy, Celia. They might have spared your life." I smiled faintly. "What good is a life spent begging?" He closed his eyes, nodding slowly. "They'll hang you in the square at dawn. I know. Do you want to say anything before that?" I looked at him, really looked. He was kind, weary but kind. "Tell them," I said softly, "that I cooked them one last meal. Tell them it was the truth." He didn't understand, not at first, but later I think he did. When he left, I pressed my hand against the cold stone wall and whispered to the air, "I ain't afraid." For the first time in my life, those words were true. The night before they were to hang me, the air in the jail was thick and still. Even the crickets had gone silent. The moon hung low and pale outside the window, its light spilling across the rough stone walls like milk. I sat on my cot, hands folded in my lap. The iron cuffs gone now, there was no need for them anymore. Where could I run? There was nowhere left to go but up to the gallows. I'd been given my last meal, a plate of cornbread and beans. The sheriff said I could have anything I wanted, but I didn't ask for luxury. I'd fed others all my life, and I knew that food meant nothing when your heart was already full or broken. I ate quietly, one slow bite at a time, tasting the salt, the earth, the memory of every meal I'd ever cooked. It was strange, I felt no fear. Only a kind of calm, like the still water before a storm. Samuel had come that afternoon. They let him in under the sheriff's watch. He looked older than I remembered, his beard flecked with gray, his eyes heavy with sleepless nights. When he sat across from me, he didn't speak for a long time. "I've been thinking," he said finally, his voice low, "about that night, about what you did." I met his gaze. "And what do you think now?" He swallowed hard. I think you did what you thought was right." The way he said it, soft, trembling, carried both love and sorrow. I reached across the table, my fingers brushing his. "They took everything from us, Samuel, everything. I had nothing left to give this world but a reckoning." "I know," he whispered, "but reckoning's got a price." I smiled faintly. "I already paid it." He pressed his forehead to our joined hands, and for a moment we sat in silence, just two souls bound by the same pain, the same impossible love, the same ghosts. When he left, he turned once at the door. "I'll be there tomorrow," he said. "I won't let you go alone." When the cell door closed behind him, something inside me loosened. The last thread tying me to this world had been spoken, not broken, but set free. As the night deepened, I lay back on the cot, staring at the ceiling. I thought of my children, Thomas with his bright laugh, Mary with her quiet eyes, little David who loved to hum while I cooked. I wondered if their souls were watching me, if they knew that I had done all this for them. "Mama kept her word," I whispered to the dark. "Mama didn't let them forget you." The preacher came near midnight. His footsteps echoed softly through the corridor, and I knew it was him by the rhythm, slow, steady, like someone carrying the weight of too many souls. He sat outside my cell, hands clasped around his Bible. "Celia," he said gently, "do you wish to pray?" I shook my head. "No, Reverend. I already talked to God." He listened quiet, didn't say yes or no, just listened. He sighed. "You know, many believe he forgives all sins." I looked at him, the moonlight catching the lines on my face. "And do you believe that?" "I want to," he admitted. "But I also believe some souls carry burdens too heavy for mercy." I nodded slowly. "Then I reckon mine's one of them." He leaned closer. "There'll be a crowd tomorrow. They'll come not for justice, but for spectacle. You'll see hate in their eyes. Don't let it break you." "It won't," I said simply. I've seen worse. He closed his Bible, stood, and placed his hand on the bars. If there's anything you want said after, I'll say it. Tell them I ain't sorry, I said quietly. Tell them I did what needed doing, and I did it with both eyes open. The preacher hesitated. That's not repentance. No, I said, it's truth. He bowed his head and left. When the door shut, I sat up, restless. I couldn't sleep. My hands itched for work, like they always did when my mind was racing. I wished for my kitchen, for the smell of spices, for the rhythm of a knife against wood, for something to do with this body that had served others all its life. But all I had was the thin blanket, the iron bed, and the ticking of the clock down the hall. Somewhere far off, a bell tolled midnight. I thought of the plantation, the sound of frogs in the swamp, the hiss of the fire, the way the stars had looked on the night I ran. Freedom had tasted like smoke and river water that night. Tomorrow, it would taste like air, just one last breath of it. The sheriff came once more before dawn. He didn't carry a lantern. He just stood outside the bars, his face half in shadow. You need anything, Celia? I shook my head. You've been quiet all night. I've been talking to ghosts, I said. He rubbed his chin. You scare me a little, woman. I smiled faintly. I scared them too. That's why they want me dead. He grunted, almost like a laugh, but it caught in his throat. I reckon you're right. He turned to leave, then paused. You'll get a chance to speak before the rope if you want. I'll speak, I said. He nodded once, then walked away, his boots echoing until the sound disappeared. When silence fell again, I closed my eyes and let my mind drift. I saw the river, wide, dark, endless. I saw Mama Ruth standing at its edge, her hands held out, whispering, "Come on, child, it's time." I rose from the cot and went to the window. The moon was fading, replaced by the faint blush of morning. In that pale light, I felt something stir inside me, not fear, not sadness, but peace. My life had been pain and servitude, but my death would be mine, and that, I thought, was freedom. I whispered their names one last time, Thomas, Mary, David, and pressed my palm to my chest. Mama's coming home. When the first rooster crowed, I sat down on the cot and waited. The footsteps came soon after, steady, measured, final. The key turned in the lock. It's time, the sheriff said softly. I stood. My knees didn't tremble. My hands didn't shake. The sun had begun to rise, painting the horizon with gold. I smiled. Then let's go. The morning of my hanging rose soft and gold, like the sky itself, didn't know what was about to happen. When they came for me, I didn't cry. I'd done enough weeping for 100 lifetimes. 2 guards led me out of the cell, their boots clicking against the stone floor, echoing through the narrow corridor. I walked between them with my head high, the smell of dew and horse sweat meeting me as the door opened to the yard. A small crowd had already gathered, men in hats, women clutching their children, all staring at me like I was some beast dragged from the forest. The gallows stood in the center, tall, rough wood, rope swinging gently in the morning wind. I could hear the creak of it, that soft, haunting rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I'd always imagined that the day of my death would come with terror, but it didn't. There was a strange stillness inside me, the kind that comes when you finally stop running. My whole life, I'd been chased by hunger, by cruelty, by fear. But now, at last, there was nowhere left to go. The end had come to me, and I met it with open eyes. The preacher stood beside the platform, his Bible clutched tight, his lips moving in silent prayer. When he saw me, his eyes glistened with something that wasn't pity, it was respect. The sheriff nodded to me as I climbed the wooden steps. The boards creaked beneath my bare feet, each sound sharp, final. Samuel was there, just beyond the crowd. He stood alone, his hat in his hands, eyes locked on me. I smiled faintly when I saw him. Even from that distance, I could feel his sorrow, heavy as the morning air. The hangman adjusted the rope, checking the knot. "You got any last words?" he asked, his voice rough, indifferent. I looked at the faces below, so many eyes, some wide with hatred, others with something closer to curiosity. They wanted to see the monster. They wanted to see if I'd beg, if I'd cry, if I'd repent. But I wouldn't give them that. I stepped forward, letting the sun warm my skin one last time. "You called me murderer," I said, my voice steady. "You said I was wicked, unholy, cursed, but none of you ever asked why." A murmur rippled through the crowd. I continued, "You see, I wasn't born to kill. I was born to serve, to scrub your floors, wash your clothes, feed your children. And I did for years. I fed you, even when you starved my own soul. I cooked your feasts while you beat us bloody. And when I finally gave you a meal that matched your cruelty, You called it sin. Someone in the back shouted, "She's a devil woman." Another spat on the ground. I didn't flinch. I turned my gaze toward the preacher. You said God forgives all sins. Maybe he will forgive me. Maybe he won't. But I know this. He saw what they did. He heard the cries in the fields, the lashes on our backs, the prayers that went unanswered. Maybe I was his answer. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "That's enough," he muttered. But I wasn't done. I looked back at Samuel, my voice softening. "To the ones I loved, if you're listening from wherever the free souls rest, know that I did it for you, so no one would ever forget your names." The wind stirred. The rope swayed slightly, brushing my shoulder. I closed my eyes and took a breath. "I am not afraid," I said, "because I already walked through hell and this ain't it." The hangman hesitated, looking to the sheriff for the signal. The preacher lowered his head, whispering, "Lord, have mercy." The sheriff's voice came low. "Do it." I heard the lever click, the sound of the trapdoor swinging open. The world tilted beneath me, one sharp jolt, one breath caught in my throat, then silence. But death did not come like a storm. It came like a whisper. I felt the air rush past my face, felt my body drop, and then light. Not the light of sun or fire, but something gentler. For a moment, I was no longer on that platform. I was standing barefoot in a field. The grass was tall, swaying like waves, and the air smelled of magnolia and rain. I looked down and saw my hands clean, unscarred. I heard laughter in the distance. "Mama?" a voice called. I turned, and there they were, my children, running toward me, their faces bright, their arms open. I fell to my knees as they reached me, pulling them close, burying my face in their hair. "I'm here," I whispered. "I made it." The world around us shimmered like morning fog. I saw other faces too, the slaves who died before me, the ones who'd vanished in the fields, the ones who never got to speak. They stood watching, smiling, their chains broken, their eyes shining with peace. One of them stepped forward, Mama Ruth. Her hand touched my cheek. "You done good, child," she said softly. "The world will remember." I looked around, tears spilling down my face. "Remember what?" "That even a cook can bring down a kingdom," she said. "That even the smallest hands can hold the power of justice." And then the vision began to fade, the sound of the crowd returning, the creak of rope, the gasp of witnesses. My spirit rose as my body fell still. They buried me in an unmarked grave outside town. No stone, no name, just dirt and wild grass. But the story didn't end there. Weeks later, the townsfolk whispered that the plantation where it all happened had burned to the ground. No one knew how. Some said lightning. Others said the devil himself came for the souls who feasted on cruelty. But the older ones, the field hands who'd lived long enough to see both horror and hope, said it was me. Said my spirit came back through the fire, walking the halls one last time. Said they saw a woman in a cook's dress, standing in the doorway, smiling while the house turned to ash. They called me the Sweet Flame. And every year after, when the magnolias bloomed and the summer heat thickened, folks said they could smell something strange near the old ruins, not smoke, not death, but something sweet, like sugar burning slow in a pan. Some said it was a curse, others said it was justice. As for me, I say it was remembrance, because even if the world forgot my name, it would never forget the taste of that wedding feast, nor the woman who served it. I don't know if the dead sleep. I only know that I never truly did not, even after the rope stopped swaying. My story did not rest in the dirt where they left my body. It followed the wind, slipped through cracks, and found its way into whispers. It became a ghost, just like me. I used to think revenge would taste sweet, like the sugar I stirred into their tea, like the honey I drizzled over their biscuits. But revenge, I learned, has a strange flavor. It burns slow. It lingers. It doesn't fill you, it hollows you out. Sometimes I drift back to the old kitchen in my mind. The fire glows, the pots bubble, and I'm standing there again, apron tied, knife in hand, heart heavy with secrets. I hear the laughter upstairs, smell the perfume and wine, see the way light spills through the doorway. That moment, that single, terrible, beautiful moment lives forever. If I could speak to you now, whoever you are listening, I would tell you that I never planned to become a murderer. I planned only to survive. But survival for people like me was never simple. We were born on the edge of death, taught to smile through hunger, to serve through pain, to thank our chains for not being tighter. When they took my children, something inside me broke, but something else woke up. A fire. Not the kind that burns wood, but the kind that burns injustice. It whispered to me while I cooked, while I smiled, while I obeyed. It said, "They think they own your body, but your hands still hold power." And so I used them, these hands that once baked bread for my masters, to write an ending of my own. I know the world called me wicked. They said I brought ruin to a good Christian family. But tell me, what goodness feeds on the suffering of others? What holiness keeps another soul in chains and calls it God's order? No, they were not good. They were proud. Proud of their land, their bloodline, their cruelty. They thought they were untouchable, and maybe they were until I touched them. I remember their faces that night. The master's mouth open in disbelief, the mistress clawing at her throat, the bride's eyes wide as the truth sank in. It wasn't joy I felt, not really. It was silence. After all the screams they'd given me, silence was my victory. People ask why I didn't run sooner, why I didn't choose freedom over vengeance. The truth is, freedom without justice felt empty. I couldn't leave knowing their laughter would echo in the halls where my children's cries had died, and maybe, in some cruel twist of fate, I was born to be their cook to serve them one last time. But this time I served them truth, bitter, final, and just. In the years that followed, my name was erased. No record, no marker, no mercy. They buried me deep, hoping time would smother my memory. But memory doesn't die easy. It hides in stories, in the mouths of those who saw, in the fear of those who remember. I became a whisper in the wind, a flicker in the fire, a warning. Mothers told their daughters, "Don't be cruel to the ones who feed you, for they might feed you your end." And in a way, that was enough. I didn't need a monument. I had my story. Sometimes I wonder if God ever looked down that night, if he saw me standing over those dishes, trembling with fury and grief. Did he turn his face away? Or did he whisper, "Go on, child, let justice be served"? Maybe I'll never know. Maybe I don't need to. Because I know this. When a soul is crushed, it either breaks or becomes unbreakable. They broke my body, but my spirit. My spirit learned to cook fire. If you could see me now, not the hanged woman, not the slave, but the voice that rose from silence, you'd see that I was never gone. I am in the stories told around the fire. I am in the songs the old women hum while stirring pots. I am in the prayers whispered by those still fighting to be seen as human. You can still find me where injustice lives, standing quiet in the corner, waiting for the right moment to lift the spoon again. I am the cook, the servant, the poison, the memory. And if that makes me a monster, then let history tremble at the taste of what it made me become. Somewhere out there, the ruins of that plantation still sleep under the weeds. They say nothing grows right on that soil anymore. The grass burns quick in the summer. The fruit sours on the branch. Some call it curse, I call it balance. Balance is all I ever wanted. Not forgiveness, not redemption, just balance. So if you ever walk past that old ground and smell something sweet, don't run, don't be afraid. That's not the smell of death, it's the smell of truth. Burnt, sugar, and sorrow. My final recipe. And if you listen close, you might hear my voice in the wind, whispering the same words I spoke before I died. They ate from my hands. They died from my mercy. Because mercy, when mixed with pain, becomes something sacred, something unforgettable. Now, my story belongs to you. Tell it, pass it on. Not to glorify me, but to remember the fire that lives in the hearts of the forgotten. Tell it so that no one ever again looks into a slave's eyes and sees nothing but property. I was a cook. I was a woman, I was a mother, and I was the storm that swallowed my masters whole. That is my confession. That is my freedom. And to those who still wear invisible chains, let my story remind you, even the smallest flame can burn down a mansion built on cruelty. Now, if you've heard me, if you felt my story, then don't let it fade into silence. Speak my name in your heart and keep the fire alive, because as long as someone remembers, I am still cooking. If this story touched you, if you felt the fire, the pain, the truth, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to Slaves Era for more untold voices, real stories, and haunting confessions from the shadows of history. Comment below what you felt, and share this story to keep her spirit alive, because every forgotten soul deserves to be heard once more.